Hi, I'm Weston LaBar, Chief Strategy Officer at Cargomatic. Here with us today is Jon Gold from the National Retail Federation, here to share insights about what's going on for America's retailers throughout the global supply chain and what we can anticipate moving into 2023. Jon, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Weston. Always good to chat on these issues.
So, Jon, what's going on from the retailer's perspective? It's been a topsy-turvy 2 years. 2022 has been a crazy year as it relates to record-setting volumes the first half of the year for one coast, and then massive drop-offs, and then record-setting volumes for the other coast the second half of the year. Obviously, we have a holiday season where folks have corrected issues that impacted their ability to sell products last year. And then going into 2023, I think there's a lot of the same clouds of uncertainty that haven't been solved, whether we're talking about labor negotiations, whether we're talking about regulation that hasn't been completely built out, or whether we're talking about regulation that will impact the supply chain, such as California clean truck rules that, quite frankly, a lot of us know are going to have an impact, but we don't know exactly what the impact may be other than capacity constraints. So what are your members telling you? What are you seeing? Tell us a little bit about the world of Jon Gold and the NRF.
Thanks, Weston. Well, I mean, I think, look, you started out, we've been in a supply chain crisis situation the past, 2+ years throughout the pandemic, as we've seen unprecedented growth in import volumes and the impact that has had across the supply chain and all the challenges we've been facing at every step along the way, from, just securing product overseas to securing space, securing empty containers, port congestion here, congestion on the rails, full warehouses, lack of equipment, lack of workers. I mean, everything has been a challenge over the past couple of years.
That's it? Nothing else?
Nothing else. But I think, look, despite that, we've been able to move record amount of volume of cargo through the system, despite all the challenges we've faced. And part of that has been the strong demand we've seen from consumers over the past couple of years as well. And that demand has continued, it has not subsided. We've seen, month on month retail sales grow for almost the past 30 months now. So it's been a lot of pressure there for retailers to be able to meet that consumer demand. But I think, on the whole, retailers have done a really good job trying to address those issues and making sure that products are there for the consumer when they want them. And it's even more important now coming into that all-important holiday season, which is really make or break for the retail industry. I mean, the fourth quarter really is the busiest time for the nation's retailers. And, we just put out our holiday forecast a couple of weeks ago, and we're looking at between 6 and 8% growth during the holiday season over last year. And last year we saw record numbers at about 14% over the year prior. So it has been significant growth that's continued, but yet, retailers are continuing to be able to meet that demand. As you noted, inventory issues were a significant issue early on this year. And part of that was because you saw a significant swing in that consumer demand, coming into this year. During the pandemic, we saw $1 trillion swing in consumer spending away from services to consumer goods. Because when you're locked down, you got nothing to do, you're going to go online and buy stuff. I mean, I know I spend a lot of money looking, getting, products for my kids, keep my kids entertained. So
and specifically durable goods, right?
Exactly.
Things like furniture,
exactly,
which most people don't buy every year, right? So if you were thinking about getting new furniture or home office furniture, which some people didn't have but then needed. I know we had a neighbor who replaced their TV with a big back on it, a la late 1990s, early 2000s, with a complete home theater system because they were watching a lot more movies. These are things that don't get replaced all the time. And so where you saw, to your point, massive upticks on certain types of durable commodities, especially in home furnishings and exercise equipment, they're not going to replace those in many cases for 5 to 10 years or more.
No, that's exactly right. And when you had everybody working from home and folks, focusing more on athleisure wear than, business wear, and then all of a sudden things opened up again and folks had to make that shift. So, retailers have adjusted appropriately. I mean, I think, look, consumers are finding a lot of deals right now on a lot of different products. So, now is a good time for the consumer, not just on holiday merchandise, but other merchandise as well. You continue to see, sales that many retailers are having across the board.
John, quick question, because, as we look at the demand and as we've talked about for a while, that we're going to continue to see some variation of supply chain distress as long as consumer spending habits are high and e-commerce continues to be a prevalent form of consumption, because e-commerce creates this stress on the supply chain due to the expectation of same day or next day delivery. But when you're seeing the information of your forecasts and the reports from your members, I've heard from some that they've seen a switch in the branding potentially that folks are buying, a la maybe not buying the designer, but they're buying something just a tier or two below that. As we know, a lot of younger, especially in fashion, a lot of younger consumers are not as intrigued by labels as, let's say, the millennial generation was. They want a plain shirt. Well, so if the plain shirt is $100 versus $50, the $50 shirt will do just fine. So we've seen I've heard a lot about like volume is fine, but in some cases, maybe they're making less per SKU than they were previously. The other thing is we are still seeing credit card rates stay the same, which credit card rates are a big indicator of consumer spending, because while we see interest rates on things like mortgages, car loans, like real capital expenditures have gone up due to the Fed, credit card rates have pretty much stayed between 18 and 22% by and large, and thus people feel comfortable spending. So in our world, we look at volume and revenue, and in some cases, volume is up, but the revenue per shipment is down. So you're watching that as capacity as a supply demand part of the equation for us. But are your members talking about revenue growth and consumer spending growth tied hand in hand? Or are they looking at, hey, we're still selling things, we're going through our inventory that we built up for the holiday season, but maybe the spending habits have changed? Because I think that's also a big tell in what we see for the economic outlook of 2023.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think they're still looking at both. And I think inflation is having a lot to do with where the consumers are spending their dollars. Obviously those in higher spending brackets, they're looking to shift down a little bit. They're looking not to do kind of that big name brand, but maybe looking elsewhere and shifting down a little bit. So looking at options, looking at off price and mass market and things like that. So I think retailers have certainly seen that, but, as you noted, consumers are still spending. I think they're starting to dip into their savings now where they hadn't previously. Part of that was as consumers were pretty much, were being paid to stay home, so there was a lot of excess money that a lot of consumers had that they were out there, spending on. So I think that's starting to tighten up a little bit. But again, we've seen over the past, 2.5 years now that consumer spending continues to grow. And I think consumers are eager to spend on the holidays. I think we're in line with where we were last year again, which was, kind of record setting, but spending on gifts and decor and wanting to be with family and celebrate. So I think folks are very eager to do that. There's a lot of unknowns as to what happens in 2023, especially on the economy. Does inflation continue to remain high? Do we get into some kind of recession? I think, many experts now saying if we do have a recession, it will be short and flat and won't be extended. So will not have that much of an impact, but still it's, folks are concerned as to what's going to happen. And again, it's not just going to be something that hits us here in the US, but it'll be global in nature. Many other countries are facing much higher inflation than we are, but that has an ongoing impact, and just the ongoing uncertainty of kind of, what happens next. As you and I kind of joke at times, there's always something that happens in the supply chain. There's some kind of disruption activity that happens, whether it's unforeseen or self-inflicted, something happens. What happens with, the war in Ukraine, does that extend? Does that get ended? Unclear. What happens with the US-China trade relationship? I think prior to kind of this week, there were a lot of uncertainties about that. But the fact that, President Biden and President Xi had a meeting, actually met and had a conversation, and hopefully have opened the door to more conversations that hopefully will thaw some of the frostiness that's there. And hopefully we can resolve some of the ongoing trade dispute issues and kind of, take away some of the tension that's currently there. I think that's important, but, a lot of questions of, what happens with Taiwan, and if that's an issue, that's going to be a much bigger issue than just the U.S. being involved in that kind of a situation.
Well, and to your point, one of the biggest focuses of the government has been how do we fight inflation, specifically as it relates to inflationary costs of supply chain, whether that be fuel related, whether that be tariff related, right? And how we can control that as best we can so it doesn't get down to the consumer. But then at the same time, as industry's been challenged to reduce cost, but have a better service and get things through the network faster, we're fighting things like clean truck policies that drastically increase the cost of equipment and of moving goods. You talk very, very aggressively about the tariffs and what that does to the cost of consumer goods, because even the folks that have figured out how to get around tariffs, a lot of it's been a diversification of supply chain that adds more cost to actually moving the goods from where they're being manufactured to here where they're being consumed. And even the nearshoring for folks, that is a cost. And if you build a factory in Alabama or Mississippi, as opposed to in Sri Lanka or Vietnam, right? It's going to have a higher cost, and you're looking at a different type of skill set for workers. So can you talk a little bit, because I know this is something that's near and dear to your heart and your members' heart, the role, good and bad, that governments played this year in the supply chain and how we move things through the network, and then ultimately the cost to the consumer?
Yeah, I mean, look, first and foremost, I think one of the lessons learned from the past couple of years is the need for more risk diversification within the supply chain. And I think that even started prior to the pandemic with the start of the trade war and the China 301 tariffs, as many companies, not just retailers, but manufacturers and others who rely on China as a trading partner, look to diversify their exposure in China. I think, as everybody realized very quickly, it's tough to diversify. Being able to find new vendors takes time. It's not something you can do overnight. And it's something we try to kind of explain to government officials and others, that it takes time to go out and find a vendor that can meet all of your qualifications that you need, not just for the manufacturing of a good and the sourcing of a good, that they meet all of your ethical standards, CSR, but they meet quality and quantity, but they meet required testing that's done by the U.S. government, things like CPSC and product safety testing. That all takes time. But again, ensuring you have the skilled workforce to do that. They have the capacity themselves to do that. They have a working infrastructure. They have regular calling by vessels, deep channels, so the bigger vessels can get in. That all takes time. And it's not as easy to say, well, make everything here in the U.S., because we don't have the ability to do that. We have 5 million open jobs that we can't find people to work for right now. So, how are you supposed to shift things back here for jobs that people don't want to do? And
going back to the state of the economy, right?
Right.
You're having a hard time filling jobs because you don't have people with the right skill set and or in the right location, especially as we start to look at things like return to office, or for many of yours, return to manufacturing facility, right? That shows you that you can still go get a good paying job in this country, which, again, just talking about the strength of the economy, the supply chain's an anomaly right now. But when you look at it, the economy as a whole is still doing really well. Yeah. And part of some of the challenges that you're talking about, the inability to find labor, the shifting, that's where the inflation's coming from. It's coming from the attempt to respond, as opposed to what we're typically used to from an economic force coming in and driving down the job market, driving up inflation and creating a gap.
Yeah. And as far as, the question of, what has the government done, what works, what doesn't, I think, as we've talked about on the supply chain side, I mean, there are limits as to what the government can do. I mean, most of the supply chain is privately owned, privately run. But I think some of the work that they have done to get the right stakeholders together, talk about the issues and to try and figure out how do we address the issues that existed well before the pandemic. I mean, you and I have been working on, port congestion related issues well over a decade now. Yeah. And it's still the same issues we're dealing with on gate fluidity and things like that need to be addressed. And this is the time to do that, because while the trade might subside a little bit now, we know those volumes are going to come back. So now is the time to try and address that. And let's figure out some good operations that work for everybody. And let's get it out of the mindset of, my job is to, this one small step in the supply chain, I get my container here and then I'm done. You got to think about the holistic vision of the supply chain. Look at how what you do impacts everybody else.
It's a network of networks.
It's
an ecosystem.
That's right. And I don't think people kind of realize that when looking at the supply chain. It's, don't just focus on your little piece here, because again, what you do impacts somebody else. If you only fix this one little piece, the rest of the supply chain still has challenges. So, now is the time to really focus in on this. And, it's great that we passed this big, the infrastructure bill, last year and got that signed into law. It's great that we're making the investment in the physical infrastructure, the hard infrastructure that we sorely need, because we haven't done the investment that we needed. And, fixing roads and bridges is all a key part of this. But we can't lose sight of, if we're going to really truly have a 21st century supply chain, we've got to focus on the IT side of this too, and create better information sharing opportunities, so we can identify when a problem is going to occur, and how do we act at that point in time to correct or course correct to address those issues, because we don't have the ability to do that right now. I mean, you got some good work happening at Port of LA with the port optimizer. Long Beach has a thing they're working on, the supply chain superhighway. But all these systems need to work together, and they've got to bring all the stakeholders together to get that right information. And I feel like we're not doing that, and we're missing an opportunity to focus on that, as well as just the straight business practices of appointment systems and turn times, and how do we crack that nut and finally address those issues to create better fluidity throughout the system.
Well, and we're a technology company that moves freight, right? And everything you're talking about, I've always felt like is really going to be speared through innovation from the private sector. It's great that we have the public sector's attention. It's great that you have the willingness, and in many cases the desire to convene the stakeholders and get to solutions. But this is going to be figured out by the private sector. And it's really about the government creating standards, and about talking about things like data quality, as opposed to trying to come up with some proprietary solution, right? And we have for instance, we have our OneSource offering, where we do have complete end-to-end visibility for our customers, from on the water reports to terminal events to rail events and trucking events. And it's been one of the things our customers have asked us for. And to your point, it's about, who do we need to work with if there's a missing piece of that data chain, to make sure that we can add that layer of visibility. And what I've thought is so interesting, to your point, we talk about the last decade, and every year we add a year and add an event, but we talk about, like, every year there's some sort of once in a lifetime catastrophic event that disrupts the supply chain, whether it's a weather event, whether it's a labor disruption, whether it's a pandemic, a bankruptcy, fill in the blank. We've had so many unique things that have happened. And that's just going to continue, because it is such a large and fragmented system. But to your point, it's the technology, it's the data, it's the connected virtual connective tissue that is going to solve these issues and allow the assets to operate smarter. And what I find so refreshing this time around, before I get to the question, is we have industry stakeholders that are coming to us and saying, okay, we're ready to have those conversations you wanted to have a year ago when we were just trying to fight fires. We've got equipment providers talking about, how can we better put equipment in position to be utilized and have better asset utilization. We've got terminal operators talking about, how can we get things off dock faster? How can we work with the right stakeholders? How can we layer in the technology that gives the shipper the ability to take control of their supply chain and get the information they need when they need it and where they need it? I think this is also important, because everybody sees we're going to have to build the church for Easter Sunday, for every Sunday, to take the analogy. That is what people are preparing for, because I think they're seeing more and more that this isn't changing. Consumer spending is something that is going to happen, and there's going to be a need to move things around in and out of the country and around it. And now is the time to plan, because if you're a terminal in LA Long Beach, you're looking at what's going on in New York, New Jersey, and you're going, we need to win that freight back. And the only way we can do it is to show that when there is a disruption, we can handle it, and we can handle it better than they can. And I would say that every time somebody gets bombarded with volume, they give folks reasons to go try something else. Let's just put it that way. So on that note, what are you seeing going into 2023? Because we all know what happened. It was a tale of two halves, right? It was the first half of 2022, lots of inventory that missed the mark from a seasonal consumption perspective. We had a lot of folks front loading cargo through the West Coast because of concerns with labor negotiations. They didn't want to get burnt like in 2014. And then all of a sudden, the East Coast gets flooded with that volume. As we move into 2023, what do you think is going to happen? In 2014, the East Coast kept some of that market share, but LA Long Beach specifically built it back up, right? But a lot of it was the rising tide lifted a lot of boats. The second thing that I would say is, what do port authorities need to do to win back your members and the hearts of the importers? And what are the concerns that they're looking at going into 2023?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there's still so many unknowns about what's going to happen in 2023 with the economy and the consumer. On the import volume side, I think, through our global port tracker, we're certainly predicting a softening of the import volumes going into January and February. I don't think we're predicting much further out than that. I think we do 6 months out. So unclear what's going to happen there. Again, if we don't have a recession, I think that's good news, and you'll see the consumer continue to spend. But what do ports need to do to kind of win that cargo back? I don't think things are going to change until we have a contract on the West Coast, to be honest. I think a lot of people are still concerned about the fact that we don't have a contract, the fact that there have been some episodes that have been reported in the press, whether in Seattle, Tacoma, in Oakland, at APM. So there's the ongoing incidences that are happening, and until we get a contract in place, folks aren't going to want to make a quick shift back. But I think, again, being forward thinking and trying to address the ongoing challenges that we've been facing again for the past 20 years is going to be important, and trying to make it clear to folks that if we do have an episode, we're going to be able to respond quickly. And here's how we're able to do that. Here's how we're able to address the ongoing challenges and get the right people at the table and have plans in place to be able to move quickly and not be impacted too much by whatever's happening. Because again, every incident is different. It really kind of depends. But providing that I don't want to say security, but more confidence that things can be addressed, and more certainty. Let's take the uncertainty out of this going forwards. I don't know that we'll ever be back in a place kind of pre-pandemic to whatever the normal is that we were in. I think now I know people hate the phrase of planning for the new normal, but it's being prepared and being more resilient going forward. I think that's where a lot of my members are focusing on now, is that resiliency, because there's so many different issues that can impact the supply chain at every different level that we're dealing with. And how do you adjust and kind of react quickly when that time is needed? So I think they're looking for the partners that can do that, and for the port authorities to make sure that they're working closely with the BCO, the terminal, the carrier, the trucker, and labor. And then we're all working together on this stuff, because at the end of the day, it's got to work for everybody. We've got to have a solution that everybody can rely on. It's going to work for everybody across the board. Just saying we're going to go to weekend gates, that's great, but does that work for the trucker? Does that work for the BCO? So, before you announce a solution, let's actually have a conversation to make sure it works for everybody, so that folks utilize it, and don't just say, well, we offered it, nobody used it, so we're going to try something else.
Yeah, to your point, the biggest thing that we're doing is everything's around resiliency and agility, the ability to pivot quickly, and the ability to make sure that there's contingency plans in place when something does go awry. And that's something that's really resonated with our customers, because what they've said is, when things work, they work. But with the traditional providers, when they don't work, they really don't work. And having the ability to pivot from an LA Long Beach to, in many cases last year or earlier this year, it was a smaller port, a Jacksonville, a Wilmington, a Baltimore. Having the ability to not have to switch providers or understand local market intelligence, but be able to say, yeah, go ahead, get on that ship. We'll move those 100 containers out of Wilmington as opposed to out of LA Long Beach. Huge value proposition, laying in the visibility. So folks are not wondering, where is my cargo? But at least you can work collaboratively to say, hey, for whatever reason, it's stuck in this terminal and it's not being loaded to rail. But let's call them together. Let's pressure them. Like let's do this as a real partnerships. I mean, I think the industry as a whole needs to get away from this transactional nature of who's going to save me a nickel today and say, who's going to help me build the best supply chain that's going to provide the most value. And at the end of the day, the best landed cost for my product. That's where we need to get to. And I'm hearing more and more that shippers are buying into that. The last thing I would say is, from your perspective, as we go into 2023, what is the advice that you have for the folks listening to this? And they could be BCOs, they could be one of our many trucking partners, they could be the industry as a whole. But if you were to say, I'm Jon Gold, this is the NRF, and these are the top 3 things we need to focus on in 2023, what are they?
Look, I mean, I think number one is continuing to focus on resiliency and how do we build more resiliency into the supply chain. And I think the only way to do that is through partnership. And that is, you talked about it, but it's critical to make sure you got the right stakeholders at the table. You've got the right partners that can help you address when a major issue arises. So I think that, and then the communication is critical as well. And I think for many of my members, it's communication, not just with their partners on what the expectations are when something happens, but it's also the communication internally to make sure that all of your folks internally that touch the supply chain are aligned and understand what's at stake. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons learned throughout the pandemic is that there wasn't enough internal communication on kind of what was happening. The fact that, now at the C-suite, they understand supply chain, not as if they didn't before, but they understand how critical it is in that everybody needs to be aligned on what the strategy is from the beginning on how to make the supply chain more resilient. So I think that communication, both internal and external, is really important that a lot of people have been focusing in on. But I think it's planned for the unknown. Just be prepared. Recognize that there's going to be something is coming down the pike that we don't know about, and just be prepared.
Uncertainty is the only certainty.
Exactly.
Right? Uncertainty is the only certainty in this industry.
Death, taxes, and ongoing uncertainty is the only thing that is certain in these days.
Exactly. Well, Jon, thank you for joining us. I always appreciate it. We'll do this again for sure, especially as we continue to monitor what's going on in the economy and how we get through the holiday season and start to enter next year. I'm sure we can do one of these very early in 2023. But any parting words for the audience?
No, just thank you, Weston. Always appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation. And, look, there are events that are on the horizon that could happen. I mean, as you and I talked about, we could have a rail strike in a few weeks that's going to impact the supply chain. So be prepared. We're going to have a great holiday season, but just, be prepared for whatever's next.
All right. Thanks so much, Jon. We really appreciate you. And thanks everybody for joining us here on Cargomatic's series of industry experts and what's going on.